Since the release of Monster Hunter 4, it has been possible for monsters to have powered up states of being that enhance their strength in various ways, where beating them grants the player with unique rewards. Almost every new entry in the series since then has added something new, and in this video, we're going to discuss them one by one, what made them work, where they went wrong, and how they improved upon each other over time. Gore Magala is a central character in Monster Hunter 4's and its expansion stories, being the flagship monster of the base game with the ability to inflict you with a deadly virus known as the Frenzy. Eventually you defeat him, but he survives, and evolves into a new form that is capable of inflicting the Frenzy virus upon other monsters. Frenzied monsters are a new type of powered up monster encountered mid to late game. They're coloured with a purple tint, with glowing red eyes and purple breath spewing from their mouths. Frenzied monsters are stronger and faster than monsters you'd encounter in standard quests, and they sound a fair bit different too. They are capable of inflicting the Frenzy virus onto you with attacks, which previously was something only Gore and Shigeru Magala could do. The Frenzy virus is one of the more unique statuses in the series. When you're inflicted, a meter slowly begins to fill. This is a timer, and when it completely fills, your ability to naturally heal is reduced for some time. The only way to avoid this is to deal enough damage, which will raise your affinity, and this creates an interesting dynamic where being aggressive rewards you while putting you in more danger, while being too defensive can be a detriment. In Universe, when a monster has the virus, they'll go absolutely ballistic, causing carnage everywhere, and so they have to be taken out as soon as possible. Almost every monster in 4 and 4 Ultimate can become frenzied, but there are exceptions. The Great Jaggy, Monoblos, White Monoblos, all rare species, all variants, Acantor, Eucanlos, and every single Elder Dragon. Some of these monsters are too elusive to ever catch it, while others are too strong and can resist it. It's likely the virus kills Great Jaggy before he can do any damage. So frenzied monsters can be pretty dangerous, but there are rewards for beating them. You receive Frenzy Crystals, which can be used to meld items and talismans. I would say Monster Hunter has always had two core endgames, taking on tough challenges and fighting various monsters for the gear you need. 4 Ultimate helped not only bolster, but fundamentally change both the endgames for the future. Let's talk about late game challenges. In the past, they could be pretty hard, throwing you up against various combinations of tough monsters, where you would battle them either back to back, or even at the same time. Throwing the Frenzy virus into the mix raises the stakes, because now everyone on the quest will be much more dangerous. Normally, going up against a Brachydios and an Azor-Rathalos together can be pretty tough, but I'd feel confident going in. But this quest is frenzied, and that gives me pause, knowing it will be a lot tougher than normal. Or how about a Seregios, Black Diablos and a Rajang? Pretty hard already, but once they're frenzied, it's a whole new experience. The beauty of this system is that yes, the strong are made stronger, but now the weak or mid-game monsters are also a fair bit more dangerous too. Under normal circumstances, a pair of Quetzalcoatlus or Zamtrioses wouldn't be too difficult to take down, but when frenzied, there's that element of extra challenge that forces you to be more careful. The increase in stakes also applies to 4 Ultimate's guild quests, where you have a procedurally generated quest that you have to level up over time, which gives better rewards and raises the challenge too. And one of the ways they do this is by making the target monster or any invaders frenzied eventually. In terms of the second core endgame, which is going after monsters to grab the gear you need, frenzied monsters enhance this by spicing up the challenge. Monster Hunter is an inherently grindy game, where you have to do the same thing repeatedly for a chance at getting a rare drop. It's fun, but it can get old after a while. With the frenzy, the added challenge makes it a little more interesting, being able to fight a spiced up version of what you've already been fighting. The reward of Frenzy Crystals makes talisman grinding a little easier too, which helped a lot because they were so important in the older games. Overall, it's a fantastic system, mostly. I would say the purple tint on everyone does get a bit old, but overall, it really enhances the longevity of the game, raises the challenge when fighting various monsters, and I really must praise how it raises the stakes of the story. Fighting the frenzied monsters really helps sell you on why Shigeru Magala is so dangerous. If you don't take him out, you'll be dealing with these infected monsters forever. So frenzied monsters are an example of a powered up state, something we'll be seeing a lot going forward, where monsters have simple attributes like health, attack power, and speed altered. But 4 Ultimate in particular adds a new type of super powered up monster, the Apexes. So do you remember how hunters could be affected by the virus, but by being aggressive enough could overcome it and gain an attack boost? Well, certain monsters can also do that, gaining a permanent boost and becoming Apex monsters. Apexes are strong, fast, powerful, and nearly impervious to attacks from hunters. They can also have altered movesets compared to their standard forms, with quite a few new attacks. They can also produce and spread the virus on their own, making them just as dangerous as Shigaru Magala. There are 8 Apex monsters, 2 from every generation of Monster Hunter, and each with minor differences while in the Apex state. Diablos and Gravios, Rajang and Tigrex, Zinogre and Deviljho, Seregios and... Tidal Najarala? Huh? Whatever. Frenzied monsters are indicated by an icon, with the word Outbreak surrounded by question marks, while Apex quests have a different icon with a claw mark. I've covered the moveset differences in other videos for most of the Apex monsters in my Evolution series, which you should totally check out if you haven't already, but the short version is that in the Apex state, they use attacks that belong to similar monsters or variations. Gravios in particular uses attacks from Black Gravios, as does Apex Diablos with that of Black Diablos or Monoblos. Not just this, but their bodies are extremely tough, deflecting any possible attack. Only their weak points can be safely hit, so for a monster like Rajang, it would be his head, arms and tail. Anything else will cause your weapon to bounce. Now you might notice I said the Apex state. This is because, if you like, it can be temporary. 4 Ultimate introduces items called Y-Stones, which can apply special properties to your weapons to counter Apexes and frenzied monsters. The Drive Y-Stone completely mitigates their tough hides, Brace increases defense against them, Force increases attack power, and Element increases elemental and status power against frenzied monsters, while allowing you to deal status against Apexes. Dealing damage with a Y-Stone will eventually knock them out of the state, where they'll go back to normal. Eventually they'll re-enter it, but you do have somewhat of a breather period. Apex monsters have their own theme that plays while they're in that state. Knocking them out will disable it, returning them to the standard theme. When they re-enter the state, the theme comes back. Beating them will reward you with Zenith Wyvern gems, which can be used to hone weapons. You can either give them an attack boost, defense bonus, or lifesteal properties. A pretty good reward that can give you a good edge in battle. Apex monsters are some of the biggest challenges 4 Ultimate has to offer, especially in high level guild quests. However, among many, there are huge points of contention. Firstly, the Y-Stones. On one hand, they're quite useful for frenzied monsters, being able to tip the scales against them for a while and having an easier time. But unless you're incredibly skilled, they're borderline mandatory for Apex monsters. The issue is that their effect is limited and their cooldowns can be quite long. The Drive Y-Stone is arguably the most important one, allowing you to bypass the biggest defense the Apexes have. It has the shortest effect at 65 seconds and the longest cooldown at 130, meaning upon activation you essentially have a DPS check, where the reward is knocking them out of the Apex state and the punishment is, just dealing with them in the Apex state and prolonging the fight massively. Now, you do have the option of carrying 2 Y-Stones, and you can freely use them either both at once or alternate between them, and I find knocking them out of Apex with Force or Brace isn't too hard, but it is really frustrating without Drive. We might have 2 slots, but I don't know anyone who doesn't use Drive as it's just too helpful. I think I would have preferred it if we didn't bounce, but did 0 damage unless we were hitting weak points, with Drive allowing us to deal damage. Alternatively, work the Drive effect into all Y-Stones. I also have an issue with the choices they made when picking monsters to become Apex. Tidal Najarala is genuinely a bizarre addition, and I reckon they only picked him because he's the most challenging new non-flagship in 4 Ultimate. The game's Elder Dragons are already pretty challenging, but regardless, it is a shame that they get no enhancements at all. It could have been really fun. Something I quite like about frenzied monsters and Apexes is that they're affected by a virus that kind of transforms them. So sometimes they start quests already frenzied, but on many other occasions they will start completely normal. After a short while, they'll appear to fall asleep and the virus will awaken, with ominous music for the frenzied monsters. and chaotic music for the apexes, showing that something deadly is about to awaken. So those are the Frenzied and Apex monsters, our very first powered and super powered up monster states in the entire series. Overall, they were very unique ideas that tied into the game's story very well. The Apex monsters are a good reason for why we still encounter Frenzied monsters after the death of Shigaru Magala. These states raise the stakes and challenge of certain quests, and the rewards are pretty good. The Y-stones are a little too cumbersome to deal with, which was an issue to many people, especially combined with how they impacted the difficulty of the apexes. It will be interesting to see how they address those drawbacks going forward. They'll either fix them, or introduce new ones. Before we move on, let's make one thing very clear. While the Monster Hunter developers know how to reiterate and refine old ideas, they usually do new things, so Frenzied and Apex monsters are exclusive to 4 Ultimate, and Generations introduce something new. Having some form of endgame activity, as well as a powered up monster state, became the standard for Monster Hunter games going forward. Generations was the very next entry, bringing in Hyper monsters. Hypers visually are normal monsters, but with glowing red spots on different body parts. Any attack involving a glowing body part will have altered timing and deal more damage. However, attacking them will cause your Hunter Arc gauge to increase faster, indicated by the edge of the screen glowing. The spots shift to different positions throughout the fight. For a monster like Tigrex, it might be on his head, arms, or tail. Hyper monster quests are indicated by the monster icons glowing a certain way. They have a larger amount of health than normal, and cannot be exhausted during a hunt. All monsters can become hyper, with the exception of Elder Dragons, Variants, special bosses, as well as certain weaker monsters. So you might be thinking, what's the story behind these guys? That's the neat part, there isn't one. They just show up with all these weird abilities and no explanations. Generations is not a game that's particularly concerned about story, but this was still a bit disappointing. Beating a hyper monster grants you hyper materials, which are unique to each monster. Hyper Rathalos materials from Hyper Rathalos, same with Xenojiiva or Nargacuga. There's also general hyper materials, acquired from killing certain types of monsters, and all of these materials can be used to upgrade weapons to the maximum. In a lot of Monster Hunter games, many weapon trees end early, or branch off into something else, meaning weapons belonging to weaker monsters will often stay weak. This was before layered weapons were a thing, so if you really like the designs of weak weapons, you would be out of luck. But in Generations and Generations Ultimate, pretty much every single weapon can be upgraded to endgame level, where they're all kind of viable, and this is thanks to the hyper materials, as they're necessary for those final upgrades, making this a pretty good reward for taking them down. Hyper materials can also be used to craft the R and XR series of armors, which are alternate designs specifically intended to be used for mix sets. Many of these armors have alternate designs and can look really cool, and some of which are really powerful. The Deviljho and Shogun Senator armors when combined can result in a very popular mix set thanks to the skills they provide. Now on paper, I do quite like what they've done with hyper monsters. They retain their normal colours and incentivize you to target specific monster parts in a way I feel is more clever and less punishing than for Ultimate's apexes. I like how attacking them increases your Hunter Arc gauge, but you take more damage if you get hit by them. It's also pretty cool how they glow a little more when there's an attack coming, just to warn you. And of course, allowing any weapon to become endgame viable is a great reward for taking them down, not to mention the armors. Which is why it's such a shame that I don't like fighting them. For one, the fact that they don't exhaust at all basically ruins the pacing of a lot of fights. The whole reason that state exists is to give you a bit of a breather, you know, to let you rest after the monster finishes being enraged. Combined with significantly higher health pools, it turns every fight into a slog, and kind of messes with some of them. After all, Hyper Deviljho can no longer use his acidic saliva, which arguably makes that fight easier, and is very disappointing considering the Y-stone mechanic allowed us to knock the frenzied monsters out of their state, which technically gave us a breather there. A big problem with the weapon upgrading system is that in Generations, hyper materials were used to max out weapon trees, and when Generations Ultimate released, it continued on from those trees, which effectively meant that if you finished Generations and moved on to G rank, you would find out that you can't yet upgrade your weapons using G rank materials, because you would need to max them out with the high rank hyper parts. It's silly and something they absolutely should have removed. 4 Ultimate forces you to fight the occasional frenzied monster as a key quest, and Apex Seregios isn't urgent, but the fights are largely not mandatory. But in Generations Ultimate, you will have to fight some of these guys if you want some decent weapons, which does suck a fair bit, considering how much of a slog they can be. Generations Ultimate features special monsters called Deviants. These are monsters that went through very specific circumstances in life, and ended up becoming far stronger than their original forms. On the surface, I wouldn't describe Deviants as this game's super powered up state, as these monsters are just as, if not more fleshed out than subspecies, but functionally, they are separate from the game's main content and are considered endgame challenges. Deviants are designed to bring out a monster's strengths. Notable Deviants include Dread King Rathalos, Hellblade Levinus, Silverwind Nargacuga, or Bloodbath Diablos. I won't go into all the differences, remember you can watch the evolution videos for that, but I will describe one, just so you get an idea of what they're all like. When you think of a Shogun Cyanotaur, what does he do? He attacks primarily with his claws, and by spraying you with his liquid. Rustrazor Cyanotaur is far better at spraying his fluids with the Gravios Skull, being able to sweep the beams and accurately aim them at you, but his claw attacks really shine when he trades the Gravios Skull for that of Glavenus, thus being able to sharpen them the same way Glavenus sharpens his tail. His claw attacks become much deadlier as he can inflict bleed and gains access to new attacks, including a giant spin that inflicts defense down. Eventually, he switches back to Gravios, focusing again on firing his juices. Both aspects of Shogun Cyanotaur have been massively enhanced to create a very dynamic and interesting Deviant, and this is the case for most of them. Deviant monsters have different sound effects to the standard forms, including roars. Generations introduced 12 Deviants, each with 10 quests. Each quest ramps up the challenge in interesting ways. Gen Ultimate also gives them 6 additional Deviant quests, which can be even crazier. The Gen Ultimate Deviants only have 6 quests, so while they're tough, there's less to do for them. Completing each quest gives you 1 or more corresponding tickets, named and numbered after the Deviant quest you completed, and these tickets are used to craft and upgrade Deviant armor and weapons. Crafting requires a ticket from the first quest, and then upgrading will require subsequent 2nd, 3rd, 4th and so on tickets. So if you want to grind a single Deviant armor set and weapon all the way to the maximum, you'll need 6 of each ticket, meaning you'll have to complete all 15 quests at least 6 times, so 90 in total. The armors are quite strong and do tend to look really cool, and the weapons have the unique effect of increasing your Hunter Art charge rate. It's also worth mentioning that the 16th quest isn't mandatory for any upgrades, but it's the hardest Deviant quest. You have to fight the monster in a specific arena, and the attack power and size are extremely high. Beating the quest grants you a crown and special pigment. The only EX Deviant I ever beat was Bloodbath Diablos, but now I have this dark blue colour that glows red, similar to Bloodbath's veins. Each Deviant has something unique, and it's honestly such a cool reward. I think that as fights, the Deviants are really cool. I admire the work the developers put into this quest system. They seem to have taken inspiration from 4 Ultimate's guild quests, but instead designed fixed challenges, rather than have them be randomly generated. The rewards are really good too. However, the Deviants are so insanely flawed that to this day, Bloodbath is the only one I've grinded to completion. I've discussed the grind as a pretty bad issue, but did you know that the Deviant quests are treated like pre-world urgents? That is to say, if a squad of 4 were to complete a single quest, it only counts as complete for the host. So if this squad wanted to complete all 16 quests of a monster for everyone, they would have to do 64 total, not counting failures. That's really long, and not in a good way. This does let you rack up a lot of tickets, but that's kind of a problem too because there's just too many. It doesn't help that, like the hyper monsters, the Deviants do not scale well with the addition of Generations Ultimate. The newer Deviants only have G rank gear that only needs to be upgraded a few times to reach the maximum. But with the Generations Deviants, you will have to complete all 10 upgrades to get them G rank viable, from where you will have 5 more upgrades. I feel like it would have been better to make craftable G rank gear available if you cleared the G1 quest, but that's not the case at all. It's a massive shame overall, because it makes them so much less appealing to grind. And finally, the music. Like the Apex monsters, the Deviants do have their own theme that plays for all but one. Like the Apexes, it's fairly threatening. The problem with this theme is that it's not particularly great. Like a lot of Generation's original tracks, it tends to be quite repetitive and short, and it doesn't use real instruments. But the worst part is that due to the inherently grindy nature of the Deviants, you'll be hearing it a lot. The Apex theme worked because you weren't fighting them as much, and knocking them out of the state would change the track, which made the fight feel dynamic. With the Deviants, you hear this over and over again for every quest except for Bloodbath Diablos, who, being a flagship of Generation's Ultimate, is treated differently and has his own themes, both of which are very good. Looking at Hypers and Deviants, it's clear that Generations tried to be more ambitious with its powered up states. The rewards are a lot better and more creative, and the way they're structured means there's a lot of choice and content, but they also tend to be slogs. Hyper monsters aren't as interesting as frenzied monsters, let alone the standard fights, and Deviants can be a long, arduous grind, and of course neither of them scale well for G rank, which to me implies that Generations Ultimate was not initially planned, and was something they decided to do after work on Generations was complete. In any case, they did take several steps forward, and perhaps the next game would be able to improve on what went wrong. Following the defeat of Monster Hunter World's final boss, tempered monsters began to appear in the game's investigations. These monsters have been living in the New World for a long time, and thus have been imbued with bioenergy from the Elder Dragons. Now what is bioenergy, you might ask? I've played World and Iceborne, and I still don't know. It's the cause of a lot of things in that game, including tempered monsters, who have become stronger from it as a result. Visually, they look rather shiny, and in combat they enrage faster, power up faster, and gain immunity to flash bombs. And that's kind of it. They're a decent step up from the standard monsters, but otherwise do not change the fights as much as frenzied monsters, or especially hypers. Unlike those states, even Elder Dragons can be tempered in World. The exceptions are, once again, the weaker monsters and some special bosses. They're indicated by a purple outline on their icons, and during quests, they have blue scoutflies rather than green. Elder Dragons in this game also have blue scoutflies, and this does not change for tempered elders. In World, monsters are divided into 3 tiers, which dictate what kind of streamstones they drop. Streamstones can be used to meld decorations, which are randomly distributed in this game. They can also be used to upgrade defense on armor beyond the maximum. There are special streamstones called Shining and Sullied, which can be converted into warrior and hero streamstones, which can be used to augment weapons with a variety of different effects, kind of like 4 Ultimate's weapon honing. Sullied and Shining streamstones can be gained from tier 2 tempered monsters, but are more common from tier 3. In Iceborne, you instead gain Spirit Vein gems from the 3 different tiers, but only in the Guiding Lands, which are used for master rank augmenting and charm upgrades. I think tempered monsters are generally pretty good. Visually, they're different in a subtle way that's not distracting. They raise the challenge and stakes of a fight in a way that does make the monster harder, but not a slog like with hyper monsters. There are no risk-reward mechanics like the previous games though, which is a bit of a shame. A common criticism of tempered monsters is that due to the distribution of rewards, you are kind of wasting your time if you don't go for the tier 3 tempered elders, as they give you the highest chance of obtaining the best streamstones. To me, that's more of a flaw with the endgame system rather than the monster, and a lot of endgames do have this problem where the very highest threats grant the best rewards, making everything else kind of meaningless. For Ultimate is quite notorious for this. I personally dislike how they're tied to the random decorations, but that's more of a Monster Hunter World problem. It feels unfair to blame it on the tempered monsters. Generally they're fine. The lack of a risk-reward mechanic makes them mechanically less interesting than the frenzied and hyper monsters, but they still provide a good challenge. It kind of goes to show that sometimes playing it safe is a good thing, and the rewards are valuable, even if a little poorly distributed. Monster Hunter World also has a superpowered state, reserved only for Elder Dragons, who are known as Arch-Tempered. These were distributed over time through event quests, and are designed to be harder not just thanks to arbitrary stat increases, but in many cases their behaviour and attacks. They have a darker sheen to them, and are indicated by an orange glow on their icons. They're the equivalent of 4 Ultimate's Apex monsters. The Arch-Tempered Elders in World are Kirin, Teostra, Kushala Daora, Valhazak, Lunastra, Zora Magdaros, Korv Taroth, Xenojiiva and Nergigante. Iceborne only has 2, Namiel and Velkhana. All other Elders in the expansion, including Shara Isvalda and Vitalis, are exempt. The Arch-Tempered Elders in World are not available to fight in Iceborne either, although some of the moveset differences were included in the standard Master Rank fights. The differences can be as simple as Kushala's wind being much stronger, or boring fights like Xenojiiva getting massive overhauls with several new attacks. Arch-Tempered Nergigante may as well be the game's true final boss. He jumps and slams much more often and even has his own theme. As does Arch-Tempered Velkhana. The reward for beating these monsters is a new set of armour, crafted from tickets obtained at the end of a quest. These sets largely have better defense, skills and stats, which make them pretty useful. Once again, there's no kind of risk-reward mechanic, and no knocking them out of this state. They're just super powered up monsters, with less grinding than the Deviants, but arguably better rewards than the Apex monsters. The issues I have with Arch-Tempered monsters are that generally there is a huge disparity between how much each Elder was upgraded, with dragons like Kirin barely getting anything, while Xenojiiva gets a huge overhaul. In addition to this, only 2 out of Iceborne's 5 Elders even got new forms. Shara Ishvalda didn't get one, which is very disappointing because he desperately needs a quest that skips the first phase of the fight. A fair amount of Monster Hunter final bosses have 2 or more phases, but also have a later quest that completely skips the first one. G-Rank, Nargacuga and Nawa the Allmother are notable examples. With Shara, you still have to complete the boring rock phase before the fight really ramps up. I also think it would be nice to have Arch-Tempered fights in more quests rather than these events. The Deviants had several pairing them up with different monsters to create crazy challenges, and the nature of the guild quest system meant you could find all sorts of combinations of monsters. Aside from say Arch-Tempered Kushala being in Teostra's quest, there is not much done with them. The world Arch-Tempered's not being in Iceborne is a little bit disappointing too. Overall though, while mechanically less interesting than Frenzied and Hypers, they're still a good example of a super powered up state for monsters with a good reward system, and it's nice that Elder Dragons finally got to be powered up in some way. So by now, with 6 entries in a row featuring some form of powered up monster state, it's safe to say it's become a standard for Monster Hunter games now. Apparently not, because Rise doesn't have any. Rise is a weird game. A significant portion of its development was done during the pandemic, and when it launched it was kind of incomplete, with it being impossible to kill an Elder Dragon at launch. This was rectified within a few months, but regardless it left a bad taste in people's mouths. In any case, Rise has no kind of powered up monster, or any endgame state for that matter. At most, it had some methods for melding talismans. At the time it was criticised for being bare, unfinished, and lacking content. However, at the time I was kind of fine with it. It was refreshing in a sense, not having a long grind to deal with, especially because I'd been playing a ton of GU right before its release and was kind of sick of hyper monsters. So Rise did give us a fresh new look into what a Monster Hunter game looks like without powered up states for monsters for the first time since the 3rd generation, and to be honest, it was panned for having a lack of content, which is really interesting considering it had more monsters than World. It shows that what people want and expect from these games is longevity. Fact of the matter was that a good chunk of Rise's roster was kind of worthless once you were strong enough, and some kind of powered up state could have fixed it. Now I've sold Rise a little bit short, because it did have a super powered up monster, kind of comparable to Generation's Deviants. The game introduced rampages, a new type of quest where a horde of monsters attempt to breach through a stronghold. It's tower defense in Monster Hunter essentially. You'd hold off the waves until the end boss appears, and killing them would end the rampage. Some of these end bosses could be Apex monsters, who were mutated by the storms of Wind Serpent Ibushi and became stronger as a result. At launch there were 3 Apex monsters, with an additional 3 added over the next 2 updates. They're all darker in colour, with glowing scars on their body. Functionally, they all fight similarly to their respective Deviant monsters. I've covered their movesets in other videos that you should totally check out, but it's kind of shocking how 1-to-1 they are. Apexes have their own theme that plays during rampages. Later updates added normal hunts, where instead the area or individual monster theme would play. Apex monsters have somewhat different roars that cannot be blocked by earplugs and enrage any monster within the vicinity. The reward for beating the Apex monsters are materials that can be used to make a special rampage weapon, which can be augmented to have different effects. For example, you can choose the elements of your weapon, whether you'd rather have an attack bonus or extra sharpness, or even affinity. You could also layer the rampage weapons. They were super customizable. Rampages as a whole would grant you tickets that allowed you to augment weapons from a choice between 3 different preset skills, which varied per weapon, and so the rampage weapon trees were just an extension of this really. So it does kind of sound like an endgame activity, involving powered up monsters, right? Well yes, but also no. First of all, Apex monsters do not have any unique weapons or armor to craft from them. Once you've made your desired rampage weapons, there is no reason to fight them, except for the fun of it. Not just this, but rampages as a whole were critically panned, but now's not the time nor place to get into that. There's also this weird issue of the monsters having the same name as 4 ultimate Apexes, despite being completely different in abilities and origin. I'm surprised nobody thought to call them something unique. One thing they did do right this time was avoid the issue with the Deviants where the specific theme doesn't constantly play all the time. The issue is that the Rise Apex theme is actually pretty good, and it's kind of a shame that we never hear it outside of rampages. Overall, it's hard to say why things ended up this way, not just for the Apexes, but for Rise's endgame as a whole. Were they planning something bigger that they had to cut for time? I'm not really in a position to speculate. So what did Rise's expansion Sunbreak do about this? To put it bluntly, while some argue Rise had no endgame, others argue Sunbreak had a little too much. What's interesting about Monster Hunter expansions in the past, in regards to powered up monster states, is that they always did the same thing as the base game. 4 had frenzied monsters, and so did 4 Ultimate. Generations had Hypers and Deviants, and so did Generations Ultimate. World had Tempered and Arch-Tempered, and so did Iceborne. Rise had nothing and Apexes, so presumably Sunbreak was either going to have nothing and Apexes too, or something new alongside the Apexes. The result ended up being more complicated. At launch there were no Apex monsters at all, and rampages were completely absent. It had been announced prior to launch that they weren't coming back, but it was still rather surprising to see the developers do a complete 180 on something they had clearly put a lot of time into. Rampages were unsalvageable, but that's neither here nor there. Sunbreak's story centers around parasites called the Curio, who drain the blood from monsters, and a power struggle between 2 elder dragons who serve as the Curio's hosts. Following their respective defeats, the Curio go crazy and begin to drain any monster they can find, causing them to become afflicted. This is Sunbreak's powered up monster state. Afflicted monsters are encountered straight after the final boss. They're tinted red, and every attack inflicts blood blight, a status initially used by Malzeno that drains your health but allows you to regain it by attacking back. When they become enraged, red spots appear on various body parts. Attacking them will make them explode, dealing massive damage, and if you attack enough, they will eventually be knocked out, becoming exhausted for a while before they become enraged again. If you leave them enraged for long enough, they'll eventually perform a special burst attack where they release a huge nuke, causing Curio orbs to rotate around them. After this they become neutral. It's very important to mention that attacking the glowing spots is not necessary to knock them out, it just helps a lot. Unlike frenzied, hyper, or even tempered monsters, all of Sunbreak's non-elder dragons could become afflicted. Even the basic starter ones. Well, mostly. Only monsters from master ranks 1 to 3 could be forced in this state. Beating them would debut anomaly materials, which are used to upgrade weapons to the maximum. This is of course exactly how Generations handled its weapon upgrades, and it means that once again, any weapon is viable for fighting endgame monsters. Now unlike Generations, materials are not specific to monsters. Afflicted Great Izuchi will give the same material as Rogi, Bagi and Kuliaku. It's the same case for the Bear Trio, as well as for other groups of monsters, and this gives you a lot of choice. If I want to upgrade a Gosharag weapon all the way to the maximum, I don't need to fight Gosharag, I can go for a much better monster instead. Later updates added more afflicted monsters from Master Ranks 4 to 6. Like with tempered monsters, even variants and rare species are included. The only exceptions are Elder Dragons, Lucent Nargacuga, and Violet Mizetsune, the latter two most likely because their fights are exclusive to arenas. That's a pretty good endgame overall, but this only scratches the surface. Anomaly investigations were added in the very first update, which were a new quest type that were procedurally generated and designed to be leveled up over time. Yes, very similar to guild quests. You also have a corresponding anomaly rank, similar to HR and MR, and that dictates what quest levels you're allowed to take. Initially the cap was 80, but each update increased it more and more, with update 5 ending on 300. Usually you encounter the update afflicted monsters in investigations first, before later unlocking access to their quests once you reach a certain anomaly rank. As you raise each quest above certain levels, you begin to receive new materials, and rather than weapon upgrades, these are used for weapon augmenting, like in Monster Hunter World. You spend materials to increase slots, and then spend more materials on upgrades to place in these slots. Later updates made it so having more slots would just give you a basic upgrade. The earlier upgrades require the base game afflicted monsters, but later upgrades require later materials, and so the final upgrades will have you fighting monsters like Scorned Magdamalo or Chaotic Gore Magala, among others. Many of these materials are also used to craft powerful decorations, including 4-slot jewels of existing skills, and skills that were formerly exclusive to endgame armor sets. There's also armor augmenting, where you can curious craft your armor and basically randomize it. You can apply random upgrades such as armor skills and even slot upgrades. Many of these can actually be downgrades, and so you might be rerolling for a while. And if you think that's all, you would be wrong. Finishing an anomaly investigation gives you anomaly coins, and there's also a system that gives you points if you hunt a designated monster and or a quest above a certain rank, and getting 10 points gives you a set amount of anomaly coins based on your rank. The coins can be spent on a variety of different things, including armor spheres, tickets, eggs, rare monster parts, or even afflicted materials. So I think you might understand why I said there was too much endgame. They really went from 0 to 100, but it does really tie together in an interesting way. An example I like to use is Intrepid Heart, a skill first seen on Flaming Espinass's set, that makes it so attacking will fill up a meter, that when full, will absorb a monster attack and negate massive damage to you. Very fitting for a monster like him. If you want this skill, you have 3 options. You can either make his set, or start fighting Afflicted Flaming Espinas or an equivalent monster at level 200 to craft the decorations, which are only 1 slot each. Or you can hope for the best and curious craft your armor until you get it. There's a lot of choice here, and it's the case with a lot of different skills in the game. And this isn't even everything, because we still haven't discussed Sunbreak's superpowered states, once again reserved exclusively for Elder Dragons. While the afflicted monsters eventually will die on their own thanks to the Curio, Elder Dragons can instead overcome and kill them, which allows them to become stronger. Sound familiar? Risen Dragons are significantly enhanced Elder Dragons, rolled out from updates 2 to 5. There are 5 in total, and they're unlocked by passing certain master rank levels beyond 100. In terms of moveset, they start off normal, but with a few new attacks that the base form doesn't have. At a certain point in the fight, they enter the Risen state and start glowing orange, giving them access to even more attacks. Dealing enough damage will knock them out of the state for a while, but they'll eventually re-enter it. Risen Dragons have slightly different sound effects compared to their standard forms. Risen Elder Dragons do not deal Blood Blight. The rewards for beating them are their regular materials, but also specific Rise Gems, used to make new armor with highly unique skills. For example, Risen Chameleos' armor has build-up boost, which allows you to deal more damage on attacks that deal status damage. Or Risen Chagaru's Frenzied Bloodlust, which is like normal Bloodlust, but overcoming it gives you a temporary wire bug, which does mean it's possible to have 4 at once. Rise Gems also let you make decorations containing skills from the base Dragon set, so you can give any armor Kushala's Blessing or Teostra's. Risen Dragons are also encountered in Anomaly Investigation somewhere beyond 100, thus allowing you to fight them alongside a variety of different monsters and in different locations. They grant you different types of afflicted materials, with the first 3 Risen Dragons in one group and Risen Shagaru and Valstrax together distributing the highest materials. Once you reach a certain quest level, you start fighting enhanced versions of the Risen Dragons, indicated by their icons having more fire than normal. In these quests, the dragons have alternate combos, sometimes new attacks, and are overall far more dangerous. So those are Sunbreak's powered and super powered up monsters. It's such a stark difference compared to Rise, and it's the ultimate proof that the Monster Hunter developers are very receptive to criticism. Looking at Sunbreak's powered up monsters, they very much seem to be an amalgamation of the frenzied and hyper monsters. They're tied to the plot very well and are a tinted colour. They inflict you with the flagship monster status ailment and can be knocked out of their powered up state. They also highly encourage you to target specific parts. Risen Dragons have overcome their specific affliction, are powered up Elder Dragons, can be knocked out of their enhanced state, and have alternate movesets. The rewards for both allow you to forge decorations, max out weapons to endgame status, augment them, meld talismans, and forge new armors, which is pretty much a huge combination of every previous endgame reward. Overall, they made quite a few good decisions with the Afflicted monsters. First of all, Rise did not have an endgame, unlike the 3 games prior, and this gave the developers the freedom to do whatever they wanted with Sunbreak, as the Affliction is very much based on what happens in this story. But more importantly, do you remember what happened with Generations? How the high rank weapons could not be upgraded to G rank without doing the boring high rank hypers? Because Rise just didn't bother to have an endgame, but Sunbreak does, these upgrades are only in Master rank and right at the end, so the problem is completely avoided. Regarding the hypers, I didn't particularly mind that each weapon would require a specific hyper part from the specific monster, but I think I very much prefer how Sunbreak handles it, by having a material granted by a group of monsters instead. Technically Generations also did this in addition to the other way, but ditching the monster specific materials was a good move. It gives you so much more choice in how you want to handle things because you'll need a lot more afflicted materials, and so having the choice to grind different monsters is greatly appreciated. Next up, the glowing body parts. It would have been far worse if they forced us to hit them to knock them out of the anomaly state, and I'm very glad they're merely a bonus. It means you have a strong incentive to go for them, but they aren't forced, which is great because of how hard some of them can be to get. Simply dealing damage to the monster's natural weak points can often be enough. Speaking of the glowing parts, did you know that just like hypers, afflicted monsters have a ton of health too? Under normal circumstances, they will definitely take a while to kill, but because bursting each spot does a lot of damage, their health goes down pretty fast. The weapon augmenting means that as the investigation levels go higher and higher, you become stronger, so there's rarely a health and damage disparity between you and the monster. It's very minor, but some monsters have special anomaly bursts, where they'll have it follow their special attack. This includes Garen Golem, Seething Basilgoose, or even Chaotic Gore Magala. I'm unaware of any others, but it's still pretty cool. I also very much appreciate how the anomaly bursts are not screen wiping guaranteed kills. They're reminiscent of Teostra's Nuke and 4 Ultimate, which was close range but could be avoided if you were paying attention. It means that failing sucks, but isn't a total loss. In previous games, multiple powered and super powered up monsters could be fought in the same quest. Sunbreak is the exception, as each anomaly investigation can only have one afflicted monster or risen dragon, not 2 or 3 or even both types at the same time. Contrast this with Generations, where Deviant monsters were frequently fought alongside hypers, and there were many quests with either multiple Deviants or multiple hypers. It's also worth mentioning that unlike the previous games, Sunbreak's powered up monsters are not featured in event quests. While we're on it, Rise's Apex monsters were quietly added to anomaly investigations from updates 2 to 5, where they can show up randomly. They have no new attacks, and don't give any new materials either. The only difference is their attack power has been scaled for Master rank. This means that the Rampage weapon tree cannot be upgraded beyond high rank. Not just that, ramp up skills in general were removed from weapons as they transitioned to Master rank, so they really left that whole system in the dirt. I think overall, afflicted monsters are a contender for the best powered up states. They're more mechanically interesting than tempered monsters, more dynamic than hypers, and like frenzied monsters you can knock them out of the state, but it doesn't require Y stones. That being said, there are still issues. With the frenzied monsters, I said that the purple tints got old after a while, and this is even more true for the afflicted monsters, except they're red, but it gets even worse when they become enraged. Rise is a game with a lot of visual effects, and so these massive glowing spots combined with the red tint and whatever the monster in question has going on can result in a visual mess, with Scorned Magnemado being the worst offender by far. Secondly, the whole knockdown mechanic feels very video gamey. Earlier I criticised hypers for never becoming exhausted. It made their fights really boring and badly paced, but also removed an important part of the monsters that truly made them feel like living, breathing things. With afflicted monsters, it's the complete opposite. They shift from neutral to enraged to exhausted to enraged to neutral to enraged to exhausted so fast and so frequently that it feels less like the monster is alive and more like they're a video game boss, which, of course they are, but the illusion is broken in a way that is a little unfortunate. Another issue is that some monsters are weirdly unsuited for this system. Xenojiiva, for example, he only becomes enraged when he's charged up, which means the afflicted fight is really weirdly paced, as he will spend huge periods of time without the glowing red orbs. Or Astalos, who generally has bad hit zones until he charges himself up. The problem is that without those hit zones, it's often really hard to deal enough damage to knock him out of rage. I also think Bloodblight isn't very good at being threatening. The health drain isn't very fast, but the lifesteal is a huge boon. It means that if I'm almost dead with Bloodblight, I simply go, oh, I'll be fine, as long as I don't get hit again. The Frenzy Virus gave you more subtle buffs and nerfs, which I think made it more effective, and the pressure of the meter rising was a better motivator to deal more damage in my opinion. If we look at the Risen Dragons, I think they're genuinely the best super powered up state we've had. They basically gave the Furious Rajang treatment for 5 different Elder Dragons and did them all very well. Aside from having solid movesets, one thing I appreciate is how genuine the difficulty feels. Iceborne's hardest fights are Electron and Fatalis, who are hard, but mostly because they break more standard conventions. With Electron, if you don't deal enough elemental damage, he will nuke the whole arena with a guaranteed kill. Or Fatalis, who's hard enough as is, but halfway through will start spewing extremely strong flames, making the fight borderline impossible if you haven't broken his horns at all. The whole thing caps off with a 30-minute time limit. The Risen Dragons are hard, but they follow the same rules as, say, Magnemalo. They all have some kind of powerful burst attacks, but they won't consume the whole arena, or even one shot. When you fight Risen Chagaru Magala, you can be as aggressive or defensive as you want, and he's still going to be pretty hard, and overall I do appreciate that about them. Risen Dragons do not inflict Blood Blight either, which is good at making them more challenging. I also really appreciate the designs of the Risen Dragons. They all share a theme of being darker, with scars all over their body, but when they turn Risen, they all glow in different parts, like their horns or wingtips, and something unique will happen depending on the dragon. For example, Chameleos sprays pink mist into the air, Teostra visibly glows, and his arms become a flame, while Kushala's wind turns golden. This makes them feel way more unique than the Arch-Tempered monsters, as well as the Apexes. Now let's talk problems. One issue I have with the Risen Dragons is that they exist. As I said earlier, Monster Hunter likes to keep things fresh and unique, and the result of that is that we will probably never see these guys again. What will likely happen is that specific Risen attacks will be ported over to the base form in future entries, similar to how a lot of Deviant attacks were given to their base forms. To me this is a shame, because pretty much all the Risens are upgrades to the originals in some way. The Deviants were all fantastic fights, and we've never really seen them again either. I also think in some cases they can be a little bit too difficult. I love fighting Risen Chagaru Magala, but there's a point in his fight where he's close to death, and every single attack is releasing giant explosions, like when he does 5 slams in a row. Now granted, Risen Chagaru is unlocked at Master Rank 180, which I think is the balancing factor. By the time you get to him, you should be long prepared. My only other criticism is that, like with Iceborne, there are some glaring omissions. It's a big shame we didn't get Risen Velkhana, as this makes her the only non-Curio Elder to not have any enhanced form. It's also a problem because she was added to Sunbreak in the 4th update, despite being about as difficult as someone you would encounter at Master Rank 5, or maybe even 6. Seeing what was done for the other Risen Dragons, it is sad that Velkhana didn't get anything. Primordial Malzeno is a substitute for Risen Malzeno, and is a fantastic fight, but he's not a Risen Dragon either, and the result is that both dragons are exempt from Anomaly investigations. They can appear as sub-targets, but not the main one, and this kind of limits how often we get to fight them there. It is kind of weird that Risen Valstrax and Shigaru are the only two monsters in their specific investigation tier. You would think that maybe Volcano was supposed to be there, but perhaps they ran out of time. Overall, Risen Dragons are the best super powered up state we've ever had, even if they do have their issues. A huge upgrade over not only the Apex monsters, but almost everything else we've had up until that point too. So, let's break down all these endgames, what they did right, where they went wrong, and how the next one improved. Frenzied monsters were the pioneer. They gave a much needed boost in difficulty for a lot of monsters, making them stronger, faster, and giving them the ability to inflict the Frenzy virus, which also had the effect of forcing you to be more aggressive, which overall made for a fun dynamic. They fit into the game's story very well, and the way they affect the monsters' voices are really cool. Where they went wrong was the rewards weren't exactly amazing, and that Elder Dragons could not be enhanced. Apexes were the first case of super powered up monsters. They strengthened the strongest of the strong, and proved to be fantastic endgame challenges. The Y-Stones provided a really unique mechanic, where they'd enter and exit the enhanced states, but in some ways it was too much. Fighting the Apexes without Y-Stones was a frustrating experience, but the rewards were a series first. Being able to add effects to weapons that help you was something that would show up in later games, so credit to the Apexes for that. Moving on to generations, Hypers continued the Apex trend of having to target specific parts, as well as a new risk-reward mechanic, as attacking them would fill your Hunter Art gauge faster. The rewards were a lot better, as being able to upgrade every weapon to endgame level greatly increased the variety of what you could use, not to mention the R and XR series being great for mix sets. However, Hypers are not very unique, and had almost no story behind them. Removing exhausts and raising their health pools made them really frustrating to fight, and due to the way Generations Ultimate was structured, you were forced to fight the high rank versions to have G rank weapons. The Deviants were very high quality, a great evolution of the Apexes, taking not just strong monsters, but the weak ones too, and emphasizing their strength in unique ways, with new designs, as well as unique armor and weapons to craft, which is a bigger reward than anything that came before. Unfortunately, the method of doing so was just too grindy, and again, due to the way Generations Ultimate was structured, the base game Deviants suffered heavily. They were given a theme, but unlike the Apexes, you would be hearing this one far more often, and it wasn't very good. With the tempered monsters, things were played a little safe. The monsters were enhanced, but there weren't any fancy risk-reward mechanics. The weapon trees were once again limited, which was a massive shame, but the augmenting system from 4 was brought back and overhauled, allowing for a wider variety of effects and more freedom of customization. Elder Dragons got to be tempered too, which was the first time they were included in any of the powered up systems, which was good to see, but of course, Arch-Tempered Dragons finally gave them something more. They were less unique or even as in-depth as Deviants, but some were upgraded enough to make them significantly more challenging, particularly Xenojiiva and Nergigante. They were definitely better than 4 Ultimate's Apexes, not to mention the rewards were pretty good and far more straightforward to obtain. Sadly, they could only be fought in specific event quests, unlike the Apexes and Deviants who could be fought in a wide variety of different scenarios. Iceborne also had some pretty glaring omissions. Then there's the Rise Apexes. In terms of fight, they're arguably better than the Arch-Tempereds and 4 Ultimate Apexes, but only because their movements are identical to that of the Deviants, with worse rewards. They were born out of a desire to do something brand new, in a game with a lot of development issues. Sunbreak's Afflicted monsters were a combination of everything that came before, in a system that was arguably a little too long to get through. The rewards are quite literally a combination of everything that came before as well, and there's not many monsters who cannot be powered up. And finally, the Risen Dragons, who feel like a combination of the Apexes and Arch-Tempered Dragons. Removing the need for Y-Stones and giving them a huge amount of new attacks gave their fights a really cool dynamic, and made them very challenging. The rewards are fantastic, and their implementation in Anomaly investigations means you can fight them in a lot of different locations. There aren't really many issues with them. They're pretty much the gold standard. I know I'll get people asking, so I'll get ahead of it. Why did I not talk about Frontier's hardcore monsters and Zeniths? There's 2 reasons for this. The first is that I have not beaten Monster Hunter Frontier. At the time of writing this, I am at HR6 and have a long way to go. I haven't unlocked a single Zenith and only have access to high rank hardcore monsters. Because of this, it would be impossible to discuss either of Frontier's powered up states in the same level of detail as that of the other games. In addition to all this, my understanding is that Frontier has always been quite separated from the main games. It's like an alternate series in a sense, except that it was a single game being updated over time, and it is drastically different to the main games. So from that standpoint, I'm not exactly uncomfortable with excluding it from discussions here, especially because once again, I'm largely unfamiliar with the game and its history. I do see a lot of people asking me to discuss it more though, and I very much would like to in the future, just not today. Overall, trial and error is deeply important to refine an idea. It took roughly 8 years to go from frenzied to afflicted monsters, and all that time was testing which ideas worked and which didn't. Considering the lack of a powered up state was the biggest criticism of Rise, I do not believe they will ever be missing from a game again, for better or worse. And because the Monster developers love to do something new every time, it's likely something new will replace the afflicted monsters and risen dragons for the next game. I'm very curious to see what will happen. There's things I like and dislike about each state, in theory and in practice. There are some that are a few tweaks away from being nearly perfect, so in ways it is disappointing that they refuse to do the same thing twice. The Deviant Wood Wild and Rise's quest structure would be fantastic for instance, and I really will miss the risen dragons going forward. But that's just how it is. Which powered up state is your favourite, and which do you dislike the most? What changes would you have made, and what would you like to see in the future? Let me know in the comments. This was all supposed to be part of a larger video that I cut down. I'm sure you can see why. Remember to like and subscribe and have a good day.